What if I told you that one of the most powerful women in history was accused of sleeping with her own son? This isn't a twisted fantasy. It's a scandal that has clung to the heart of the Roman Empire for 2 millennia. The accusation alone feels vile, a primal taboo we instinctively recoil from. But this story isn't about your neighbor. It's about an empress, a mother who clawed her way to the apex of power and allegedly used the ultimate seduction to stay there. Now transport that same scandal to the heart of the Roman Empire, to the very epicenter of absolute power. Because this is not a macabre hypothesis, it is an accusation that forever haunted one of the most powerful women in history. Her name, Agrippina the Younger. Her accuser, history itself. She was Nero's mother, Emperor Claudius's wife, Caligula's sister. A woman who pulled the strings of the world from the shadows and placed her son on the greatest throne in the known world. But the whispers, penned by historians like Tacitus, tell a far more salacious tale. To maintain her iron grip on the young emperor, Agrippina allegedly breached every conceivable moral boundary. They claim she seduced her own son, weaving a web of forbidden desire and absolute power. Today we will not only explore these chilling accounts, we will delve into the psychology of incest, its terrifying genetic consequences through real cases, and finally, separate myth from reality, in this case that has echoed for millennia. Was it a brutal political defamation or an open secret that time has not been able to erase? Join us to unravel one of the darkest mysteries of antiquity. The aversion to incest seems to be a constant in most human societies, a taboo so deeply rooted that many consider it a natural law. But where does this almost universal repulsion come from? Is it purely cultural, or is there a biological and psychological basis that drives us to avoid it? Understanding these dimensions is crucial to analyzing any historical accusation, such as that surrounding Agrippina and Nero, and to appreciating the devastating weight that such an accusation carried. From a psychological perspective, there are several theories that try to explain this aversion. The most prominent is the Westermarck effect, named after the anthropologist Edvard Westermarck, who proposed it in 1891. This phenomenon postulates that people who live closely together during the first years of their lives, generally until around the age of 6, develop an automatic sexual desensitization and a deep aversion to the idea of having intimate relationships with each other. This evolutionary mechanism would act as a natural barrier against inbreeding. It has been observed in various contexts, such as in Israeli kibbutzim, where children raised together in communities showed a total lack of sexual attraction upon reaching adulthood, or in the Chinese custom of sim-pua marriage, where a girl is adopted by a family to eventually marry the son, often resulting in unhappy marriages and low fertility due to this lack of attraction. This effect suggests that, far from being a natural attraction, the propensity for incest would require overcoming a powerful innate psychological barrier. However, human nature is complex, and there is a paradoxical exception that seems to confirm the rule: the theory of genetic attraction. This controversial concept applies to consanguineous individuals who were separated at birth or in early childhood and who reunite in adulthood. Lacking that early cohabitation that activates the Westermarck effect and sharing a strong genetic similarity, they can experience an intense and unexpected sexual attraction upon meeting. These cases, although extremely rare, are deeply heartbreaking and highlight the strength of biological ties and the psychological mechanisms that normally inhibit them. They demonstrate that in the absence of joint upbringing, nature alone does not seem to provide an infallible safeguard, which led societies to impose powerful cultural prohibitions. And the fundamental reason for these prohibitions lies in pure and hard biology. The evolutionary imperative to avoid inbreeding is not a matter of morality, but of survival. The biological cost of incest, known as inbreeding depression, is terrible and tangible. Every person carries in their genes several potentially harmful recessive mutations. Normally, these mutations are not expressed because the dominant allele of a gene pair masks them. But when two closely related people who share a large amount of identical genetic material have a child, the chances of that child inheriting two copies of the same harmful recessive mutation skyrocket exponentially. The consequences are a higher incidence of serious genetic disorders, birth defects, immunodeficiencies that make the individual vulnerable to diseases, reduced fertility, and a higher infant mortality rate. It is a game of genetic roulette, with the odds dramatically stacked against it. Nature, through evolution, has selected groups that avoided inbreeding because they were healthier, stronger, and had more reproductive success. Our psychological repulsion may be the manifestation of this deeply encoded evolutionary imperative, a way to ensure that we seek partners with a different genetic endowment to strengthen our offspring. Despite this biological and psychological basis, the cultural and religious treatment of incest has varied significantly throughout history and in different societies, which shows that it is a taboo, shaped by both nature and nurture. The most famous example of incest acceptance is, without a doubt, that of ancient Egypt, particularly among the Ptolemaic and Pharaonic royalty. Pharaohs, considered living gods, often married their sisters and even their own daughters. This practice, far from being viewed with horror, was a political and religious strategy. It sought to maintain the purity of the divine lineage, prevent sacred blood from mixing with that of common mortals, and consolidate power within the immediate family, preventing external sons-in-law or brothers-in-law from accumulating influence. Cleopatra, 7, the most famous of all, formally married her two younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, following this ancient tradition. For the Egyptians, royal incest was not a taboo, it was a ritual duty and a tool of government. This example contrasts radically with the stance of other cultures. In ancient Rome, incest was strictly prohibited, although its definition was initially narrower than today's, focusing mainly on relationships within the direct ascending-descending line and between close siblings. Roman law and public opinion considered it a nefas, an impious act against natural and divine laws that endangered the pax deorum, peace with the gods, and by extension the stability of the state itself. Committing incest was to show such a profound disregard for social order that it marked the individual as a monster, someone incapable of governing. Judaism and later Christianity, which would greatly influence later Roman law, codified exhaustive prohibitions against incest in sacred texts. Leviticus in the Bible meticulously details prohibited relationships, extending the prohibition to a wider circle of relatives. For these religions, the prohibition was not just a matter of practical health, although they observed its benefits, but a divine mandate to maintain the separation and sacred order of families and people. This diversity of approaches shows us that, while biology provides the basis for aversion, it is culture and religion that build the legal and moral framework around it, amplifying the stigma and assigning social punishment. In Rome, accusing someone of incest was not just pointing out a deviant sexual act, it was accusing them of being an enemy of natural order, an impious sinner, and a threat to the community. It was the ultimate defamation, designed to irrevocably destroy a person's reputation and honor. And it is precisely this context that forces us to analyze, with extreme care, the accusations that arose in the imperial palace. because understanding the overwhelming weight of this accusation is the key to deciphering the power game that was being played. But to fully appreciate the devastation that royal incest can cause, theory is not enough. We must observe the consequences in flesh and blood, in the dynasties that, far from rumors, practiced inbreeding with terrifying and tangible results. If the biological theory of incest tells us about abstract probabilities and genetic risks, history offers us concrete and devastating examples where those probabilities became a terrible reality. Far from rumors and defamation, there are perfectly documented cases in which persistent inbreeding, practiced to preserve lineages and concentrate power, led entire dynasties to the abyss of disease, infertility, and extinction. These cases are not mere historical speculations but objective lessons, etched into the bodies and destinies of those who paid the ultimate price for crossing the taboo. The clearest, most studied, and eloquent example of the consequences of prolonged incest is, without a doubt, the House of Habsburg in Spain. Its final decline is a textbook on inbreeding depression. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs married again and again among cousins, uncles, and nieces, weaving a family tree that less resembles a branched structure and more a closed and suffocating circle. Their obsession with sealing alliances within their own family and preventing blue blood from mixing with lesser blood led them to a genetic dead end. The final and most tragic embodiment of this policy was Charles II of Spain, cruelly but accurately known as the Bewitched. Charles was not bewitched by witchcraft but by genetics. His coefficient of inbreeding, the statistical measure of how likely an individual is to inherit 2 identical copies of a gene from a common ancestor, was astronomically high. Higher than that of a child of siblings. His very existence was a miracle of survival, but his life was a catalogue of suffering. From birth, he was a terribly sickly child. The portraits of the time, trying to show majesty, cannot completely hide the genetic stigma of the Habsburgs. Extreme mandibular prognathism, that jaw so prominent that it prevented him from chewing properly and speaking clearly. His tongue was so large that his speech was almost unintelligible and he constantly drooled. But the problems went far beyond aesthetics. He suffered from rickets, epilepsy, gout attacks, and such weak health that he did not walk until he was 4 years old. He was believed to be sterile from his youth, and his physical and intellectual development was deeply affected. Foreign ambassadors reported that he looked much older than he was, and that his appearance was cadaverous. His inability to govern effectively, and crucially to produce an heir, plunged the Spanish Empire into a succession crisis that triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a bloody conflict that redrew the map of Europe. Charles II died at 39, physically and mentally exhausted. And with him, the main line of the Spanish Habsburgs was extinguished forever. His body was autopsied and described as having not a single drop of blood, a heart the size of a peppercorn, corroded lungs, putrefied and gangrenous intestines, a single black testicle like coal, and a head full of water. This description, although possibly exaggerated, perfectly symbolizes the physical collapse of a lineage destroyed by its own obsession with blood purity. But the Habsburgs are not an isolated case in the history of royalty. If we look further back in time, we find another paradigmatic example, the Ptolemies in Hellenistic Egypt. As we already mentioned, their practice of sibling marriages was a state policy, a way to emulate the gods and maintain power within the ruling house. Cleopatra VII, the most famous of her line, was the product of generations of this practice. While she herself was evidently intelligent, astute, and charismatic, attributes that saved her from the worst physical effects, her lineage did not escape unscathed. The decline of the Ptolemaic dynasty is marked by a history of weakness, pathological cruelty, and fratricidal power struggles. Many of Cleopatra's predecessors are described as incompetent, sickly, and deeply paranoid rulers, traits that are exacerbated by inbreeding. The struggle for the throne between Cleopatra and her brother-husband Ptolemy the Fiend was ruthless, a civil war that plunged Egypt into chaos and ultimately handed it over to Roman rule. The family's inability to generate strong and stable heirs beyond the extraordinary Cleopatra was one of the underlying causes of the kingdom's fall. The practice of incest, in this case, did not strengthen the dynasty. It made it more vulnerable, more unstable, and ultimately contributed to its disappearance. Even in nature, far from royal courts, the message is clear and consistent. Conservation programs for endangered species constantly struggle against the scourge of inbreeding. When an animal population is reduced to a very small number, matings between closely related individuals become inevitable. The result is offspring with heart defects, compromised immune systems that make them vulnerable to diseases they would normally overcome, and a drastically reduced survival rate. Biologists must perform complicated genetic juggling, introducing individuals from other populations to refresh the gene pool and avoid what is known as extinction by inbreeding. It is a powerful reminder that the laws of genetics are relentless and apply to all living beings, whether leopards or emperors. These tangible examples provide us with a crucial lens through which to examine the accusations in imperial Rome. Because if Agrippina and Nero had truly maintained a persistent, incestuous relationship, and this had resulted in offspring, history would undoubtedly have recorded the consequences. The Roman Empire was a society obsessed with succession and legitimacy. The birth of an heir with obvious malformations or serious health problems would have been a monumental scandal, an event documented by every historian and used by the dynasty's political enemies as proof of the gods' wrath. However, there is no record that Nero had children with Agrippina or that any of his known children are his daughter Claudia with his second wife Poppaea Sabina, who died in infancy or showed signs of the terrible disorders associated with direct inbreeding between mother and son. The absence of this biological evidence does not by itself prove innocence, but it does raise a huge red flag against the literal truth of the rumors. If the incest between Agrippina and Nero had been a physical reality and not a political metaphor, it is almost certain that its effects would have manifested visibly and dramatically, just as they did in the Habsburg court. The silence of history on this front is, in itself, an eloquent testimony. It forces us to seek the truth not in genetics, but in the murky world of propaganda, power, and the psychology of a relationship so toxic that the only way its contemporaries found to describe it was by comparing it to the most abominable sin they could imagine. With this deep understanding of the taboo and its consequences, we can now delve into the heart of the scandal that enveloped the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The story of Agrippina the Younger and her son Nero is not a simple narrative of perversion, but a complex psychological drama of ambition, power, and a mother-son relationship so toxic that it overflowed the limits of what was speakable for its time. To understand why these rumors arose, we must first understand the nature of their bond, a connection that was forged not in affection, but in the cold ambition for power. Agrippina was no ordinary woman. She was a princess of imperial blood, daughter of the popular general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, and sister of Emperor Caligula. From her youth, she understood that power was the only currency that truly mattered in Rome. Her life was marked by exile and survival during the reigns of her predecessors, experiences that hardened her and taught her to be ruthless. When her uncle Claudius became emperor, she executed her life's master plan: to seduce him, convince him to marry her, even though incest between uncle and niece was technically illegal. Claudius had the Senate change the law, and then maneuver for him to adopt her son Nero, displacing Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. Agrippina was not a mother in the traditional sense. She was an architect. Nero was her most precious project, her living masterpiece, the vehicle through which she planned to rule the world. During the first years of Nero's reign, she was the true force behind the throne. She chose his advisors, such as the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, handled official correspondence, and even sat on a throne next to his during audiences, an unusual and scandalous act of power for a Roman woman. Nero, a teenager when he ascended, was under her absolute control. This was the symbiotic phase of their relationship. He was the public figure, she the operational brain. However, everything changed when Nero began to grow and desire his own autonomy. The turning point came with his romance with a freedwoman named Acte. For Agrippina, this was more than a youthful whim. It was a declaration of independence. Acte represented a world outside Agrippina's control, an influence she could not manage. The Empress mother reacted with excessive fury, alternating between threats and pleas. According to Tacitus, it was in this context of desperation, when she saw her influence vanish, that Agrippina resorted to increasingly extreme tactics. The historian Tacitus, with a chilling gaze, recounts how Agrippina, desperate to regain her fading influence, began to remind Nero of his debt to her, offering her vast wealth as if he were a mere dependent. When pleas failed, she resorted to a more insidious tactic, appealing to his pity, reminding him of her loneliness, and subtly suggesting a place for his mother, not just by his side, but perhaps even closer than his lover. And this is where Tacitus, with a chilling precision, introduces the language of incestuous seduction. He describes how, amidst these fraught discussions, Agrippina allegedly caressed him too frequently and with lustful kisses, setting the stage for a crime. Paratac scaena adedecus. On another occasion, during a banquet, she brazenly dressed in seductive attire and sat provocatively close to him, showering him with affectionate words and displays of affection improper for her age. Nero, reportedly unnerved and fearing the ultimate transgression, was compelled to remove his mother from the palace. It is essential to read these passages not as forensic reporting, but as historical narrative loaded with subtext. Tacitus, writing decades later with access to court rumors and with a clear aversion to the Julio Claudians, is using the language of incest as the ultimate metaphor for pathological control. In the Roman mentality, for a man to be dominated by a woman was the ultimate humiliation. To be dominated by his own mother was inconceivable. The accusation that Agrippina used lustful kisses and caresses does not necessarily describe a consummated sexual act, but paints the image of a woman who crossed all boundaries of maternal decorum to manipulate her adult son. It was a way of saying that her ambition was so monstrous that she was willing to pervert the most sacred bond of nature to achieve her ends. For his part, Nero also contributed to this narrative. His eccentric behavior, his dedication to art and spectacle above war and politics, and his evident disdain for Roman traditions marked him before the senatorial elite as a weak, effeminate, and potentially corrupt man. What better explanation for this weakness than the nefarious control of a mother who had completely emasculated him? The rumor of incest became the perfect explanation for a reign that the traditional ruling class despised. It was not that Nero was simply a bad emperor, it was that he was sick, corrupted at his core by a relationship that had inverted the natural order of the world. The accusation, therefore, served a triple insidious function. It obliterated Agrippina's reputation, branding her a monstrous pervert. It crippled Nero's legitimacy, painting him as a debased, emasculated puppet, and it became a potent weapon for discontented senators, a salacious whisper they could wield to justify their opposition. This was the ultimate rhetorical weapon, crafted to pierce the deepest Roman fears and values. The absence of tangible evidence of deformed offspring was irrelevant. The metaphor was too potent, its symbolic effectiveness far outweighing any literal truth. It was the narrative that perfectly explained the palpable, perverse dysfunction of Rome's most powerful relationship, and thus it endured, forever etched into history as if it were an undeniable fact. The relationship between Agrippina and Nero, poisoned by ambition and resentment, could not end well. The point of no return was crossed when Nero, weary of his mother's control and probably terrified by her tactics, decided that his only way out was the most drastic. The rumor of incest, whatever its origin, had created such a toxic dynamic that physical elimination became, in the emperor's mind, the only solution. Agrippina's assassination is one of the most famous in history, not only for its brutality, but for the ingenious and failed theatricality that surrounded it. Nero, still afraid to act directly, devised a plan to make his mother's death seem like a tragic accident. He invited Agrippina to meet him in Baiae, and for the return journey, he offered her a luxurious ship designed to sink in the open sea. Tacitus describes the vessel in detail: a vaulted roof loaded with lead to sink it, and sections that would detach upon hitting the water. The plan was macabre and complex. Agrippina, a born survivor, suspected her son's sudden display of affection, but boarded the ship. As planned, the ship sank, but the design failed. The roof collapsed, killing one of her ladies-in-waiting, but Agrippina managed to swim to shore, aided by a fishing boat that rescued her. Realizing she had survived and immediately understanding that the accident had been an assassination attempt, Agrippina sent a messenger to Nero to inform him that she had survived a shipwreck, implying that she was grateful to the gods and to her son for her salvation. It was a masterful and desperate move, feigning ignorance to buy time, but Nero, upon learning that his mother had survived, panicked. He could not risk her, the most intelligent and dangerous woman in Rome, gathering her forces and turning against him. In his terror, Nero abandoned all pretense of subtlety. He dispatched assassins directly to the villa where Agrippina was recovering. The soldiers found her in her bedroom, and in a final defiant act of dramatic awareness, as they plunged their blades into her, she famously cried out, "Strike the womb that bore a monster. Ventrem feri qui monstrum peperit." It was a death meticulously calculated to forever brand her son with guilt, a final chilling indictment from the woman who had created him. Agrippina's death did not silence the rumors. It cemented them forever in Nero's black legend. Matricide, the act of killing one's own mother, was perhaps the only crime that could surpass the accusation of incest in horror in the Roman mind. By committing it, Nero not only seemed to confirm all previous defamations, but he transformed into the archetype of the lunatic tyrant, the ruler who had crossed the last imaginable moral boundary. His reign became unsustainable. The Roman elite, who already despised him, now also feared him. The people who had enjoyed his spectacles began to view him with horror. The assassination sealed his fate and paved the way for his eventual downfall and suicide. So we return to the initial question. Did Agrippina the Younger and Nero commit incest? After this journey through psychology, biology, history, and propaganda, the most solid answer we can give is that it is extremely unlikely. The accusations, critically analyzed, do not withstand scrutiny. They lack the biological evidence that would necessarily have left visible consequences, as we saw in the cases of the Habsburgs. They emerge in the precise context of a fierce power struggle between a controlling mother and a son desperately seeking to free himself from her clutches. And they were perpetuated by historians belonging to a senatorial class that detested both and needed a narrative that explained the perversion of the regime. The rumor of incest was not a story about sex. It was a weapon of rhetorical mass destruction. It was the most potent metaphor available in the Roman arsenal to describe a political relationship so unhealthy, an ambition so unbridled, and a control so suffocating that it could only be compared to the violation of natural order itself. Agrippina was not accused because she was a pervert, but because she was a woman of immense power in a man's world, and her influence over the emperor was so profound that the only way her contemporaries could conceptualize it was by sexualizing and perverting it. Agrippina's tragedy is that of a brilliant political strategist who, trapped by the limitations of her time, could only exercise power through the men in her family. She created an emperor in her own image, but she did not calculate that this emperor would eventually devour her to exist on his own. Her story is an eternal reminder that in history, truth is often less important than narrative, and that rumors, especially those that touch our deepest taboos, can eclipse reality and endure long after their protagonists have died. It forces us to ask ourselves, how many other historical truths are in reality victorious defamations? History is written by the victors, but sometimes slander is written by all those who fear the power of a woman.